Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Animal agriculture is vital to Nebraska. Livestock production not only contributes to our food supply, but also helps our rural communities. Livestock provides revenue for schools, creates jobs, supports Main Street, and enhances the future for farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Board's Animal Agriculture Initiative works to encourage growth of responsible livestock enterprises to benefit agriculture and Nebraska.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, John Meuret looks at corn and soybean markets ahead of the USDA's August crop report. Bob Wright describes some of the pests emerging in soybeans. Rob Eirich talks about third-party audits in the beef industry. And Stephen Knezevic discusses the rise of weed resistance in Nebraska. John Meuret from Meuret Grain Company is our market analyst this week. Corn and soybean crops are holding strong. The latest conditions report shows both have the highest percentages in good to excellent categories this late in the season since August 2004. We talked with John Thursday afternoon near York. Give me an update on what crop conditions and moisture situation look like in your area in Nebraska.
Really good, Jeff. We just picked up a nice 1 to 2 inch general rain in northern Nebraska. Condition was starting to suffer a little bit. You really didn't see it in the beans, but you knew it's going to start cutting yield eventually. So excellent, I would say, this week.
We know that across the country, the U.S. corn and soybean crops are in really good shape. Do you have an idea of how big they might be?
Well, that's the trouble, Jeff. I've told a lot of people this, but in 2 years ago, the crop kept getting smaller. And if you can ask an end user what that felt like, he'll explain to you what it's like this year, which is the crop gets bigger every day. So I'm afraid we're somewhere north of 170. And how big north of 170, I think that remains to be seen. But we'll have to see some combines roll. We'll have to see what the wetness did in some areas. But ultimately, if you're going to take the state yield in Illinois over 200, the crop's really, really big.
And beans?
I think the same thing on beans. We all say August weather makes beans, and so far we've had rain. 50 or 60% of the whole entire corn belt's going to have a nice drink of rain through the first half of August. I think that's answering my own question, so excellent.
So speaking of the end user, where does the demand come from to eat up potentially record crops in both corn and soybeans?
Well, I think you've got to just instill some fear. And the minute you put some fear in these guys, I think you'll have them come in and start buying. But at the moment, there's no fear. They don't think that they need to buy because it's going to be there tomorrow. So anything can do that. An early frost, a clammed up farmer selling, eventually the end user comes back to the market. And the market will work. If we take prices down, we're going to spur demand, we're going to cut off some supply. So ultimately, it's hard to hear, but this is a good thing.
How aggressive should the farmer be trying to unload maybe what's left of the corn crop before he brings in the new one?
I think the game's changed a little bit. Certainly beans you need to let go of. Corn, I think he can be a little bit more patient because there's carry in the market. And if we change enough acres next year, if we have something south of 90 million acres of corn, we can have a little bit of a 350 to 450 market out there. But soybeans, on the other hand, I think need to be sold anywhere north of $10.50 or $11.
Long term, then, you're not nearly as bearish as some that are seeing low threes, maybe upper twos for a price of corn.
I'm not. No, I'm not, because I think, again, people will react quicker. I think we'll see some herd expansion in the livestock to help gobble up some of this corn. Beans, however, Jeff, I am negative. I mean, I think people look to that. I think they look to small grains and they look to beans, and we're going to crush that market.
Yeah, you did feel that we were going to hit single digits. Still think so?
I still do. Beans compared to corn are still very overpriced, and that's not a new thought. Everybody still thinks that today, but I think that shoe's going to drop here in the next month.
Let's talk about the export market. First, in corn, how strong has it been in corn?
Corn's been a little disappointing in old crop. We've hung around there, but ultimately I think we've pushed the business elsewhere, Jeff. Guys have found that it's tough to do business off the West Coast. We've got a strike problem still in the PNW. The Gulf has certainly exported the capacity up to date, but I think it's been a little disappointing in my mind.
And have soybeans gained a little help on new crop at least?
They've been excellent. We're the cheapest in the world still. I think Gulf capacities, 95% booked through about January. You've got the PNW capacity booked through about December at 90%. And so there's some bits and pieces of bean business to do, but we've done a very good job selling export bean capacity. China's not backing off, Jeff. They're there every year.
Earlier this week, we learned that Russia would ban ag imports from places like the U.S. Does that have any impact on corn or soybeans?
Almost none, Jeff, almost none. Beans, I think they took about 16 or 17 million bushel last year from the U.S., and so it's a little drop in the bucket. Corn, they took none. In fact, you've probably reported that they're actually an exporter of corn. And so, no, absolutely nothing. And I think on the livestock side, they import a little bit of chicken, no pork and no beef. And so, no, it doesn't matter.
Is there anything attractive when you look to 2015 or 2016 corn or soybeans?
I like beans. Beans today are $10.80 or $10.90 for Nov 2015. I think that needs sold. That should get you a $10 cash bean. I think there's some money there, Jeff. Corn, on the other hand, it's a little tougher, but if you're $4 to $4.25 to $4.50, D's 15, I think you need to sell it. Same thing on 2016 corn.
What does basis look like in your area of Nebraska?
Weak, Jeff. I think as we transition from the old to the new, we've got some transportation issues we've talked about in the past, and we've also got a farmer that held his old crop a little too long. So once we clean that up, I think we'll start to see that the basis get a little better in northern Nebraska and South Dakota.
Next week we get a big report from the USDA. It's the August crop report. Do you have expectations of what we'll see in those numbers?
It's tough for the USDA to come up with something higher than a 170 on corn, so I would predict they'll be somewhere around that number, give or take a bushel or two. Beans, anything north of 45 is going to be hard to do today as well. Even though everybody thinks they'll be bigger, what the government prints will probably be a little smaller. So,
how does the market react to those numbers? More importantly, do you think the trade is leaning one way or the other?
Yeah, the trade's leaning bearish. I think everybody expects big numbers. So the surprise will be that they print something smaller than that. And so I would not be shocked to see us a little weakish into the report and maybe rally a couple days after that. And again, don't get me wrong, that needs to be taken advantage of, not bought. So.
The USDA is scheduled to release its August crop report Tuesday at 11 a.m. Central. Next week, Roy Smith will join us to analyze those numbers. The latest USDA state report lists 70% of Nebraska's soybeans in good to excellent condition. Cooler temperatures likely helped lessen detrimental effects of a drier July. Most of the eastern two-thirds of Nebraska saw less than 4 days at or above 95 degrees during the month. While soybean aphid populations have been low so far, UNL Extension entomologist Bob Wright said Thursday they could start increasing.
Well, they're just starting to show up now in a lot of parts of eastern Nebraska, so now is the time you really need to start scouting for soybean aphids.
I have to imagine this weather is conducive to their development.
Right, they really don't like extreme hot weather above 95, but if it's in the 80s and low 90s, that's ideal conditions for their reproduction. And aphids can multiply relatively quickly, so it's important to scout at least once a week from now until maturity to watch for soybean aphids.
Just a refresher on what you should be looking for and the threshold for treatment.
Okay, it's really important to look carefully. They're relatively small aphids. They typically start on the upper part of the plant on new growth, and sometimes you'll see lady beetles or other beneficial insects first before you see the aphids, because they're starting to build up or attracted to where the soybean aphids are. But you want to count aphids per plant, and if you have 250 aphids per plant and there's been an increasing trend of aphids, that's when you want to spray for aphids. Right now, a lot of the soybeans are in the seed fill stage. Once we get to the full seed stage, we can handle more aphids than that. That hasn't been well researched, but we know the threshold is higher after the R6 stage. When you're sampling for aphids, it's pretty intimidating to try to count all the aphids on a plant, and we have some simplified methods that you can use. One of them is called speed scouting, where you don't have to count all the aphids on the plant. If you have up to 40 aphids per plant, you call that infested and just go on to the next plant, and there's a decision guide available online, and we also have a smartphone app from the University of Nebraska that you enter that data, and it can tell you whether you're at a treatment level, and you don't have to count every last aphid on the plant. So it's a real speed saver, and makes it a lot simpler for people to properly sample for soybean aphids.
If you're deciding to spray, are there any natural enemies that you don't necessarily want to kill off to the aphid?
Well, there's a lot of natural enemies, but if they're at 250 and increasing, that means they're not holding them down. One thing to watch for, if you had sprayed an insecticide earlier, maybe in the last month, like in combination with the fungicide, I'd watch those fields first, because you may have knocked down the natural enemies from the earlier insecticide spray, and aphids may be able to survive better in that condition.
What other pests might be out there now, Bob?
Well, we're getting reports of bean leaf beetles, and the next generation is starting to emerge, and some people are seeing spider mites in particularly dryland fields or maybe dry pivot corners where there's drought stress. So there are a lot of potential insects still to watch for.
Anything that's required treatment so far?
Not that I've heard of, but you know, things may develop in the future, so continue watching.
This has been an interesting growing year. We probably have some fields that are, as you said, along in maturity, but we also have fields that were planted later or replanted later. In those fields, would insects reemerging be a problem?
Yeah, that's something to watch for, because those are going to be attractive as the regular planting time fields are starting to dry down. A lot of insects can move around, and they'll search out the later planted beans, which are still nice and green and succulent and good food source to watch for. So you need to continue to watch those fields until maturity, the later planted fields.
On the Market Journal website, you can find a link to more information about the Soybean Aphid Speed Scouting app. You'll also be able to learn more about insect pressures at next week's Soybean Management Field Days. For more information on those events, you can watch our interview with Keith Gluen from last week's episode. Brothers Keith and Brian Burns have parlayed their passion for no-till into a thriving cover crop seed business near Bladen. The August Nebraska farmer highlights their green cover seed operation and their drive to spread information about cover crops, no-till, and soil health. Keith, pictured on the left, says they're not just selling seed, they're also providing education. In 2009, they sold 2,000 acres worth of cover crop seed. By 2013, they sold 255,000 acres worth of seed. They've shipped to 40 states and hope to hit all 50 by next year. You can read more about the success of green cover seed in the August Nebraska Farmer. Rob Eirich is a UNL Extension educator at the Panhandle Research and Extension Center in Scottsbluff. He's also the Beef Quality Assurance Director for Nebraska. Rob says one aspect of that position has been educating beef cattle producers about third-party audits. We recently talked with Rob in Scottsbluff about the purpose of those audits and about how producers can prepare their operations.
Third-party audits are not a new program in the beef industry. We have third-party audits have been involved in a lot of branded products. But within the last year, we've seen a focus of our packers and our processors in looking at doing third-party audits with the whole complete supply chain. All their beef cattle that come into their yards and so are into their plants, and so it's something that's starting to really become more prevalent, and I think it's going to move in that direction as we move forward with having so many of our consumers being so far removed from agriculture. They want to know how and where their animals are raised to produce that product that's on their dinner plate. So in the beef industry, we're seeing third-party audits becoming more prevalent currently.
What are the auditors looking for? What are they looking at in these feed yards?
You know, when they come into the feed yards, they're really looking at the basic animal care and welfare. How do we handle these animals? Are we using low-stress handling techniques? Are we making sure these cattle have clean water and making sure they have fresh feed in front of them? But not only that, they want to see how we process these cattle, making sure we're using those techniques all the way through the process from the time they come on that operation until we get them to the packer. And so a lot of it deals with animal care and welfare, but also animal health. And animal health is a key part of BQA and always has been, because we want to make sure we're producing a safe, wholesome product for our consumers.
Specifically for the producer, how does he or she know that they've been selected for an audit? What all goes into that process?
Most of our processors and packers are looking at random audits. So they will take their suppliers, put them into a pool, and they'll randomly select a certain percent to be audited that year. they will announce that, and they will let the yards really know when they're coming, or work with them to design a time, because they want to see you processing and handling. They want to see that all in that time they're there. Not only that, but they're going to look at documentation as far as, have we trained our people, have we kept our treatment records. So it's going to be a time frame where they're going to give you some time to prepare as they come into the yards. But most of our yards are pretty open about it, as far as they're wanting to show that we are doing the right things, and we're verifying that we are through this type of process.
What happens to the process, or to the producer, after that evaluation?
After the evaluation from the third party, whoever the packer or the processor is that has kind of set up the third party audit, they will sit down with the packer if there's anything that needs to be corrected. Basically, they're going to look at, they have a whole criteria set up, and it's either going to be acceptable, not acceptable, or it's not applicable for that procedure. And there's going to be a part on there, if it's not applicable, is there some way that they need to improve something within that process? Or are they not doing it, or what's going on? And so they're going to ask that. They're going to work with the feed yards to say, okay, this is where we think you need to be improving. It's an education process, and kind of move through that. And then they're going to take that material that they get, and they're going to use that for their customers. They're going to look at fast foods, restaurants, and so forth, and say, hey, we have worked with these guys, they're doing the right thing. And they're going to take that to their consumer and say, we have a safe, wholesome product that's really designed for the quality of your family and you as a consumer.
Do you think this will become more common in the future?
I believe it will. I think it's going to be pretty common. It's going to become kind of a common practice for our processors and our packers to do this with our feed yards. It's just a matter of time. Hopefully we'll design one audit fits everybody, and that's kind of the ultimate goal on the national level of BQA, is trying to get one audit and one assessment that will satisfy everybody. But we're going to see more of it as we move forward.
Rob says producers can find information on preparing for audits at the State Beef Quality Assurance website at bqa.unl.edu. In the spring of 2000, Nebraska farmers planted 72% of their soybeans to a herbicide-tolerant variety. By 2002, that share jumped to 85%. The tops were met in both 2008 and 2011, when 97% of Nebraska's soybeans were a herbicide-tolerant variety. While that technology has given producers new options in weed control, one could argue it's also played a role in fueling weed resistance. In this state, there are currently 8 herbicide-resistant weed species. 5 of those have resistance to glyphosate. At a recent Nebraska Soybean Board-sponsored field day, we spoke with Stephen Knezevic about the new challenges farmers face in handling weeds, specifically those that have rapidly developed glyphosate resistance.
Roundup Ready technology was beginning to take off like a 96, 7, 8, 9, somewhere in that range. And then the first case of glyphosate-resistant Meuret was determined or confirmed in 2006. So basically we can say, yeah, about 10 years. And now the ball is rolling. We're getting one almost every year. The latest one is common ragweed. Before that we had giant ragweed. Before that we had kochia, and then we have water hemp. So we have 5 weed species that develop resistance to glyphosate just in our state. We have about 12 or 13 across the nation.
Yeah. So surely we know more about why we're developing resistance now, but is that making a difference in how we're controlling weeds?
Of course, it better start making difference, because obviously I would say from 2000 till 2010, those were probably the best 10 years in terms of easiness and weed control. Those were the 10 easy years, and I want everybody to hear this. That all the producers and everybody that's been just going Roundup and Roundup, you had a very easy and simple 10 years of weed control. Well, now that program is slowly fading out because of these resistant weeds. So now it's the time to start doing something else out there. Start using soil applied herbicides, start rotating your modes of actions, and basically rotating your tools of weed control. I know the Roundup still works in a lot of places, but what worries me is that I want to save that Roundup for future generation. I don't want to lose Roundup. It's a fantastic chemical, and the only way we're going to save it is if we can lesser the amount of that we use out there, or go with some other products. And there's plenty of other products that we can take care of these glyphosate-resistant weeds.
Does this mean then that weed control is going to be harder in the next 10 to 20 years?
Yes, the weed control is going to be quite a bit more complicated in the next 10 years. With the introduction of new herbicide-tolerant crops, we're talking about the dicamba beans coming on the market in the next few years, let's say endless corn or soybean, which is 2,4-D resistant corn and soybeans coming in, and then HPPD soybeans coming in. We're going to have all these new crops with all these traits in, and we're going to use them, but they're not going to be as simple to use as Roundup Ready alone. We got to watch when we spray, how much we spray, and how often we spray. Some of these, like HPPD chemistries, if you have too much of a rate, with the higher rates, you are going to have problems with the rotations in the following year. And then all these crops that just walk you through going to be somewhat of a problem as a volunteer crops in your subsequent years. So therefore, you need to start learning modes of actions, basically, and this is actually geared from my standpoint towards young farmers.
That's the most important thing for them?
Right, that's the most important thing for new young farmers across Midwest or United States, is to start learning modes of actions so that you know what kind of crop you're going to have out there and which product you can use. Because the modes of actions will tell you how these chemicals work, how they kill the weeds. So if you have, let's say, problems with 2 or 3 herbicides that come from one group or one mode of action, you better use another mode of action. A different product name doesn't mean that it's a different mode of action. In many cases, it might be the same group of mode of actions, and these are the things that we need to be teaching and promoting, and the new generation of farmers better learn those things. Otherwise, the weed control can be pretty painful.
Stephen says farmers can look at information on herbicide classifications from takeactiononweeds.com. The site is sponsored by the United Soybean Board and features a chart listing different chemicals with their modes and sites of actions. He says growers can also find state-specific information in the 2014 Guide for Weed Management in Nebraska. We'll link to both resources on the Market Journal website. Now with this week's weather forecast, here's UNL Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. During this last week, cooler temperatures were the norm, as we've seen temperature deviations for the 7-day period anywhere from 1 to 3 degrees below normal. The coldest temperatures were essentially in the northern portion of the state, closer to where the main activity with precipitation occurred. We did see some scattered thunderstorm activity start to organize itself on Tuesday afternoon and develop into a fairly robust complex of activity across the southern half of South Dakota, east-southeastward through south-central Iowa. Now, the northern portion of our state, particularly north-central and northeast Nebraska, were the big beneficiaries of significant moisture. We were looking at anywhere from 3/4 of an inch to 1.25 inches broad-based coverage, with isolated pockets of 2 to upwards of 5 inches reported. Wednesday night, we've seen redevelopment in southeast, southwest, and the northern panhandle. Although they weren't widespread, we did see some isolated totals breach that 1 inch mark. And then, of course, we've seen organized development across the western portion of the state, tied in with a monsoon flow and some systems trying to work their way eastward that developed some scattered thunderstorm activity across the western half of the state. But we still are carrying some significant departures from normal for the last 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the location of the state, across the southern 1/3 of the state, and of course east central and southeast Nebraska. So we're going to need to see more activity to put away their fears for this abnormal dryness starting to impact our corn yields. So as we took a look at the upper area models, what we'll see for today is that we have a ridge that's going to try to build northward, and we have this monsoon flow moving across the northern periphery of this ridge. So the best targeted area would be the northern panhandle, north through northeast Nebraska, with some of that activity possibly sliding southward during the overnight hours into east central and southeast Nebraska, although it doesn't look to be very widespread. Now, as we go into tomorrow, the ridge starts to build northward, so the monsoon moisture will be in place. Any development of thunderstorms in the western part of the state will be there in the late afternoon hours associated with this monsoon flow. In the extreme northeast Nebraska and east central Nebraska, there is a piece of energy sliding down the front edge of this ridge that may generate some thunderstorm activity, and the best areas for that organized development would be across northeast Nebraska. On Monday, the ridge starts to build much farther northward. That effectively shuts off the moisture for eastern Nebraska as most of the moisture pools toward our east. So any activity we see developing will be in the monsoon moisture feed from the central Rockies, which means isolated thunderstorm development across the western part of the state. On Tuesday, the ridge builds even farther northward, so we are going to see widespread upper 80s to low 90s across the western half of the state. Again, the moisture feed takes that moisture in through Iowa, leaves eastern Nebraska high and dry, but we do notice some activity starting to develop across the western part of the United States that is expected by Wednesday to move into the central Rockies and then slide eastward. So we should see organized convection developing across the western half of the state, with some of that sliding eastward during the overnight hours. But more importantly, the best opportunity for eastern Nebraska for widespread precipitation will come Thursday as the system starts to make its way eastward and tries to clear the state. By Friday, we're looking at fairly benign conditions with a little bit cooler conditions possibly working in the extreme northeastern part of the state. So we're looking at scattered thunderstorm activity for the western part of the state with temperatures approaching the 90-degree mark, a slight cool down on Monday, before we start to see temperatures move back up into the upper 80s across the south and the low 80s across the north. 8 to 14-day forecast indicates another cold blast coming in with below normal temperatures, and hopefully this verifies as we do see an increase in moisture according to the Climate Prediction Center from next Thursday to the following Tuesday.
Thanks, Al. Today's information on corn and soybean markets, soybean aphids, third-party audits, and the rise of weed resistance in Nebraska can be found on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. Next week, Roy Smith will analyze market reaction to the USDA's August crop report, and Ron Plain will talk about profit margins for pig producers. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
America's export of soybeans helps the U.S. maintain a positive agricultural trade balance. Nebraska contributes half of its soybeans for export. The protein and oil content in soybeans enhance the growing demand for higher protein diets. The Nebraska Soybean Board promotes research to develop new soybean varieties with higher protein and oil content for major agricultural markets. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.